Oh, I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free and be no segregation, no segregation, no segregation, no segregation over me, and before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave.
What you just heard was a civil rights protest song pertaining to the black movement, but it does include many others because I believe it's how women, farm workers, and African Americans felt in their situation. They wanted to be liberated, treated fairly, and respected. Protesting was a way for communities and groups to be heard. Some protesting was gentle, others passionate, and many, even though it started gentle, turned to violence. And some, well, just started to be violent from the beginning. We will be looking at 3 specific protest movements from the 1960s into the 1970s: civil rights, farm workers, and the second women's movement. We will be looking at 3 specific movements from the 1960s to the 1970s: the farm workers, civil rights, and feminist activists, and see which type of protest made a change. Were the aggressive protests at better affecting change, or were the sit-ins and peaceful protests better? When we study protesting, there are a few questions we need to ask ourselves. Did aggressive or peaceful protests affect more change on issues? What were the leaders of these protests? Why did people protest, and for what? In order to understand where protesting came from, we also have to understand what exactly they were trying to accomplish with their actions, specifically peaceful and aggressive.
The Black Panther Party, marching around in berets and black leather jackets and holding shotguns, is certainly not a strategy that's going to win you white support. It's not going to get you allies. So the turn to violence is a tragic consequence of the failure of body politic to really open its arms and say, here, okay, we'll all sit together at the table of brotherhood.
Civil rights protests consisted of sit-ins and also violent actions. There were times when they started out peaceful, turning violent and ending with arrests, injuries, and death. There were also times when these protests were peaceful and personal, such as with the Freedom Riders, a group of African Americans who would ride in the front of the bus to publicly show that segregation was not the answer, and they too demanded equality. What you're about to see is a short clip from Dr. Mary Corey, professor at the University of California, and what she has to say about violent protesting. The civil rights movement was filled with many violent protests leading to death and clubbing. The violence angered many. The leaders of these violent groups, such as the Black Panthers, led by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, believed that the only way to create social change was with violence. The violence created a fear, leading to retaliation with the police and causing the FBI to monitor their group's phone calls. The Black Panthers got their ideas from Malcolm X, who also led protesters to defend themselves with arms. According to the testimony of Stokely Carmichael on March 25, 1970, he states, "Brother Malcolm used to tell us that there were several types of death. I think a dehumanized people who do not fight back are a dead people. That is what the West had been able to do to most of us. Dehumanize us to the point where we would not even fight back." President Johnson also protested, but in his own way, and he did it in the White House and was against segregation. He had a huge impact in the civil rights movement, especially by getting Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Though his insider protesting was generally peaceful, it created violent retaliation from groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Johnson's actions were meant to be positive and added another stone to the building of a nationwide wall to stop segregation. In public places, in schools, employment zones, and even in areas just down the street while you're walking. Another well-known peaceful protester was Martin Luther King. He only believed in peaceful protests and had many of his own views and philosophies that were inspired by Gandhi. I quote, "The ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy." And that is what Martin Luther King's philosophy was. Change was minimal in regards to violent protesting because the example it showed consisted of deaths, irrationality, and brutal retaliation cops had to prove back. Plus, you don't see congressional meetings consisting of guns and punches. What really caused change was the rationality peaceful protesting exhibited by gathering many people to show that a change is needed. Cesar Chavez led a 300-mile march from Delano to Sacramento consisted of Filipino and Latino farm workers protesting years of poor pay and conditions and also boycotted grapes. Mr. Chavez asked all the strikers to remain nonviolent, and the strike drew unprecedented support outside Central Valley from activists to civil rights groups. Cesar believed nonviolence was more powerful than violence. Cesar quoted Gandhi in saying, "Do something, offer your life. If you really want to do something, be willing to die for it." Cesar even fasted to show everyone how he would give his life for what he believed in. Dr. King wrote Cesar to express his greatest admiration and solidarity during this time. Finally, the peaceful protesting and hard work paid off. In 1970, the NFA was a success. Table grape growers signed union contracts granting workers better pay, benefits, and protections.
We are conscious of the historical significance of our pilgrimage. It is clearly evident that our path travels through a valley well known to all Mexican farm workers. We know all of these towns of Delano, Madera, Fresno, Modesto, Stockton, and Sacramento because along this very same road, in this very same valley, the Mexican race has sacrificed itself for the last 100 years. Our sweat and our blood have fallen on this land to make other men rich. This pilgrimage is a witness to the suffering we have seen for generations.
The women's movement of the 1960s into the 1970s was filled with feminist ambitions and goals of personal liberation. They protested for equal pay because women were being paid 60% lower wages than men, and they wanted to end domestic violence. Black women were also protesting racial exploitation, along with demand to not be a guinea pig for birth control. According to Frances Beale, in an essay from 1969, she states, "It is also her right and responsibility to determine when it is in her own best interests to have a child." Both white and black challenged discriminatory laws. The feminist chief goal was to overturn American beliefs that they were only suited for domestic housework and that men were intellectually inferior. Women's protests were generally passionate, at times aggressive, but no violence was ever demonstrated. Now that we looked at both aggressive and peaceful protests, it is easy to conclude that violence created fear and retaliation. Peaceful protesting created an unconscious change that demanded attention. We will leave off with a video from the women's protesting movement.
Hums at the typewriter, purrs
in bed. She walks, she talks, she even whips. And thanks to the research of Tony and Revlon, you can get this standard quality model wherever you go. The perfect model. She doesn't talk back. In fact, she doesn't talk at all unless you want.
All of my videos and song comes from the University of Houston online library. The opening song is from Voices of the Civil Rights Movement, Black American Freedom, 1960-1966. Delano Walking Strike was narrated by Cesar Chavez in 1965. Talks on Johnson's silent protesting inspired by Dr. Young's podcast in week 10. Primary document PDF Feminism is where I got some of my material for the feminist movement. There is Radical America Left and Right, produced by Susan Shearer in Declassified 9. Women Protesting from the 1960s, Feminist of the Times video from the University of Houston Library, October 1966, Black Panther Party Platform and Program, and What We Want, What We Believe, number 7 of that party platform and program.